Memphis, mid-1960s. Picture this. Elvis Presley, the man who filled arenas and set stages on fire, slips quietly into a small clothing store near Graceland. No entourage, no flashing lights, just a simple jacket, dark glasses, and the hope of going unnoticed for once. But anonymity isn't easy. Not because of his face, not even because of his voice. It's the hair, that unmistakable wave, and those sharp sideburns, the style he had worn for years, the very thing that had become his signature. Behind the counter, a young sales clerk, a college student working part-time, takes one look and laughs. She doesn't recognize the king of rock and roll. To her, he's just another eccentric customer with too much grease in his hair. She makes a joke, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few shoppers glance over, whispering, some stifling their own laughter. The air shifts instantly. This isn't a stage. This isn't the press twisting headlines. It's a plain room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and Elvis standing quietly in the middle of it, caught in an ordinary moment of ridicule. And what happens next will silence the laughter, rewrite the mood, and reveal a side of him the world almost never saw. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. Part 1. The Hairstyle Before the Crown. In Memphis, during the early 1950s, there was little space for eccentricity. Most young men wore their hair neatly parted, slicked just enough to look proper on Sundays. But Elvis Presley was never drawn to proper. From his teenage years, he was fascinated by the barbershop chairs, where truck drivers and blues musicians sat, the smell of pomade thick in the air, the gleam of combs dipped in disinfectant jars. There was something rebellious about that shine, about hair that refused to stay flat and respectable. At Hume's High School, he was already different. His classmates would smirk when he walked past, the back of his shirt collar stained by the petroleum jelly and hair tonic he used. Greaseball, some of them whispered, a word that stung but never made him change. He would sit at the back of class, fiddling with the curl that always fell across his forehead, pretending the laughter didn't cut deep. One boy once tapped his shoulder and asked if his head would catch fire if someone struck a match too close. The room burst into laughter, and Elvis forced a crooked smile. But inside, the humiliation burned. What those classmates didn't know was that each evening, in the small, cramped apartment on Lauderdale Courts, Elvis would stand in front of a cracked mirror, perfecting the wave of his pompadour. His mother, Gladys, often watched silently, a mix of worry and pride on her face. She once asked gently, "Baby, why you spend so much time on that hair?" Elvis, without looking away from his reflection, answered quietly, "Because when I get it right, I don't feel like just another poor boy from here." The hair became his armor. The ridicule was real, but so was the sense of power when he caught his own reflection. Someone he wanted to become stared back at him. Years later, when he stepped into Sun Records for the very first time, the same hairstyle that earned him cruel jokes suddenly became a calling card. The studio on Union Avenue smelled of cigarette smoke and warm dust from the worn floorboards. The summer air pressed heavy against the windows, and the hum of an old ceiling fan barely cut through the heat. Elvis was nervous, clutching his cheap guitar case as though it were the only solid thing in the world. Sam Phillips's assistant, Marion Keisker, was the first to really notice him that day. She later recalled how she couldn't forget the sight of this skinny boy, with hair piled high, shining under the studio lights as if he'd polished it for hours. Some of the staff chuckled quietly when he walked in, whispering to each other about that hair. But Sam didn't laugh. He saw beyond the shine, beyond the awkward shyness. When Elvis began to sing, the sound startled even him. His own voice, echoing in that small room, mingled with the sweat and the faint odor of coffee left too long on a hot plate. He was still trembling, still conscious of how people might see his hair before they heard his voice. Yet somehow, that style gave him a strange confidence. It was a reminder that he had already survived years of laughter, and now he had nothing to lose. The paradox was sharp. The very thing that made him an object of mockery at school became part of the reason Sun Records remembered him. In a world where hundreds of boys came in and out of the studio each year, desperate to be heard, Elvis's image stuck. His voice was unique, yes, but so was the sight of him. The hair framed the music, gave it an identity. As fame grew, the hairstyle hardened into a symbol. It was no longer just grease and pomade. It was a flag of a new generation. Young men across America tried to copy it, while parents and preachers shook their heads in disapproval. To the establishment, that slick wave was indecent, even dangerous. It carried whispers of black rhythm and blues, of sensuality, of rebellion against the quiet conformity of post-war America. And yet, for Elvis, it was never merely fashion. Each strand combed back carried a memory of being laughed at, of sitting in that classroom swallowing humiliation, of hearing his own father's friends remark that he looked like a fool. The hairstyle was a wound turned into armor, a scar transformed into something unshakable. Years later, when he stood under the blinding television lights during his first national broadcasts, critics mocked him again. Some columnists wrote that he looked like a circus clown dipped in hair oil. He pretended not to care, but the words stayed with him. Every time he saw his reflection before going on stage, he remembered those lines. Still, he never changed. To change would mean surrendering to the laughter, admitting they were right. That's why, when he later walked into that small Memphis shop, the scene that would become unforgettable, the laughter from a stranger over his hair struck deeper than it appeared. It wasn't just about pomade or shine. It was the echo of school corridors, of newspaper columns, of nights when he questioned whether the world would ever take him seriously. The smell of fresh clothes in the store, the glare of fluorescent bulbs, the sound of a clerk's laugh, all of it folded back into the boy who once stood before a cracked mirror, whispering to himself that he was meant for more. And yet, in that echo lay his strength. Because without the laughter, perhaps there would have been no defiance. Without the ridicule, perhaps there would have been no reason to cling so fiercely to his style. No reason to walk into Sun Records with hair that shone brighter than his confidence. His hairstyle was not decoration. It was the seed of the revolution that would follow. Part 2. The Store Incident. The afternoon sun in Memphis poured its dusty light through the plate-glass windows of a small clothing shop on Beale Street. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying the mixed scent of starched fabric and the faint chemical tang of freshly pressed shirts. A brass bell above the door jingled softly when Elvis stepped in, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. For a man who had performed in Las Vegas showrooms and filled stadiums, there was still something comforting about wandering into an ordinary store, blending, for a brief moment, with people who were simply shopping. He wore dark sunglasses and a modest jacket, hoping to pass unnoticed. But anonymity had long since slipped from his grasp. Still, in that moment, he was just a man looking for a shirt. His fingers brushed over neatly folded stacks, feeling the crispness of cotton, the cool smoothness of silk. Behind the counter, a young saleswoman looked up. She was barely in her 20s, with sharp features and a quick, nervous energy. To her, the man before her was just another eccentric customer. She noticed his hair first, the thick, gleaming wave that caught the store's fluorescent lights like polished glass. She smirked, and before thinking, she let her voice carry across the quiet space. "Sir," she said, loud enough for two other shoppers to hear, "you've got half a can of wax in that hair. Aren't you afraid it'll go up in flames if you walk too close to a candle?" The words hung in the air, sharp and mocking. The two customers browsing nearby chuckled, exchanging glances. One man even muttered, "Looks like he dipped his head in oil." Their laughter echoed, small but cutting, bouncing off the racks of neatly hung garments. Elvis froze for a moment. His hand, which had been sliding across a row of shirts, stopped mid-motion. Behind his glasses, his eyes shifted slowly toward the sound of laughter. He didn't speak right away. The silence that followed was heavier than the words themselves. The room, moments earlier filled with the harmless rustle of shopping, now seemed suspended, waiting. The young clerk suddenly realized she might have overstepped. She expected anger, a raised voice, a storm of celebrity temper. Instead, Elvis stood utterly still. His broad shoulders didn't move, his expression hidden by the tint of his glasses. The pause stretched so long that the laughter died on its own, replaced by an uncomfortable fidgeting among the shoppers. Then, with surprising calm, Elvis turned. His voice was low, steady, almost amused. "Would you mind bringing me a mirror?" he asked. The request caught everyone off guard. No confrontation, no sharp retort. Just a simple request, spoken politely, as though he were asking for a glass of water. The clerk blinked, confused, then hesitantly pulled a handheld mirror from beneath the counter. Her fingers trembled slightly as she handed it over. Elvis took the mirror carefully. He tilted it, studying his reflection under the sterile store lights. Slowly, he ran a hand across his hair, pressing it down, then letting it spring back into shape. The gesture was unhurried, deliberate, a man reacquainting himself with an old companion. The silence in the store deepened. Every eye was fixed on him, waiting for an explosion or at least a biting remark. Instead, Elvis smiled faintly at his reflection, as if sharing a private joke with the boy he once was. The boy in Memphis classrooms who endured the same laughter. He set the mirror down gently on the counter and looked toward the clerk. Her face was flushed crimson now. Her earlier bravado dissolved. She opened her mouth, perhaps to apologize, but the words stuck. Elvis spared her. "Funny thing about this hair," he said softly, his accent wrapping around each syllable. "It's the reason most people remembered me before they ever heard me sing." The room shifted. The two customers who had laughed exchanged startled looks, realizing who stood before them. One of them whispered under his breath, "Good Lord, it's Elvis." The saleswoman's eyes widened, her smirk collapsing into shame. She wanted to vanish behind the counter. She had mocked a stranger, but this stranger was no ordinary man. Elvis picked up a pale blue shirt, holding it against his chest as though testing the color. He nodded approvingly, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a roll of bills, and placed far more money than the shirt cost. "For the shirt," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, he slid an additional bill across the counter. "And for your trouble." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't revenge. His tone was even, his smile faint but genuine. The gesture was not meant to humiliate her, but to remind her, and everyone else, that laughter at someone's expense was easy. Grace, on the other hand, was rare. The clerk's throat tightened. Her eyes glistened. She could barely whisper, I didn't realize." But Elvis lifted a hand slightly, stopping her. He didn't want excuses. He didn't need them. He simply gathered his purchase, nodded once to the room, and walked toward the door. The brass bell jingled again as he stepped out into the Memphis sun. Inside, the air remained charged, heavy with the unspoken realization that something extraordinary had just happened. The laughter that had begun so casually had been replaced by silence. The kind of silence that lingers long after the sound has died. The silence of people confronted with their own smallness in the face of unexpected dignity. Part 3. The Unexpected Response. For a long moment after Elvis left his quiet words on the counter, the store seemed frozen. The saleswoman still stood behind the register, clutching the edge of the counter as though it might anchor her in place. The folded shirt rested between them like evidence of something she couldn't take back. Her laughter, so confident a few minutes earlier, had curdled into regret. But Elvis didn't let the weight of that silence linger cruelly. Instead, he leaned his forearm on the counter, lowering himself slightly as if to meet her eye, not as a star towering over a clerk, but as a man speaking to a young woman who had stumbled. He picked up the mirror again, tilted it toward himself, and smoothed his hair once more. "My hairstyle's funny, you think?" he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You might be right. But let me tell you something." He paused deliberately, letting the hush of the room settle around his words. "It was this hair people saw before they knew my voice. And it was this hair that made me impossible to forget." He set the mirror down and tapped it gently with his finger, as though sealing the statement. The customers, who had moments before been chuckling, were silent now, their postures stiff with discomfort. Every eye seemed fixed on him, waiting for anger or a sharp rebuke. Instead, he smiled, a small, weary smile that held no bitterness. "You see," he continued, "folks laughed at me a long time ago for the same reason. Laughed at the shine, the curl, the way it stuck up when it wasn't supposed to. But that shine stuck in people's minds. Stuck enough that when I walked into Sun Records, they remembered me. A boy nobody knew, remembered because he looked a little odd." The clerk's chest rose and fell quickly. She bit her lip, her cheeks burning as tears threatened at the edges of her eyes. The confidence she'd worn as armor now looked brittle, ready to crack. Elvis picked up the shirt he had chosen and laid it carefully on the counter again. He slid a thick wad of bills across, far more than necessary, then pressed them gently toward her hand. "Keep the change," he said softly. "Not because you were wrong to laugh. People always laugh, but because it's harder to take the thing they laugh at and make it your strength. That's what counts." The moment landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching everyone in the store. The two men who had joined in the laughter shifted uncomfortably, pretending to browse the racks, though neither of them moved their hands. The young woman's eyes welled up. She whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry." Her throat tightened around the words, and she looked as if she might collapse under the weight of her own shame. But Elvis, almost gently, shook his head. He didn't want her apology. He wanted her to remember, to carry something from this moment other than embarrassment. He tucked the shirt under his arm, gave a small nod, and turned toward the door. As he stepped away, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, filling the vacuum of silence. The bell above the door jingled again as he left, and the sunlight spilled in behind him before the glass swung shut. Inside the shop, the mood had transformed. What had begun as light-hearted ridicule had ended in a lesson no one expected. The clerk covered her face with her hands, shoulders trembling as the reality of what had just unfolded pressed down on her. For her, it wasn't only the humiliation of mocking a man she hadn't recognized. It was the deeper sting of realizing how easy cruelty had come, how cheap the laughter felt now. Outside, Elvis paused on the sidewalk. The air was warm, filled with the hum of traffic and the faint strains of blues drifting from a nearby cafe. He stood for a moment, breathing deeply, collecting himself. For all his calm inside, the exchange had tugged at something buried deep. The boyhood sting of mockery that never fully vanished, no matter how high he climbed. He touched his hair again, absent-mindedly, not with vanity, but with the quiet acknowledgement of what it had cost him to keep it all these years. Back inside, the young clerk wiped her eyes quickly when a new customer walked in. She forced a smile, but it faltered. She would remember the sight of him walking out, not with anger or pride, but with kindness. And that memory would stay, carved deep, long after the sound of the bell faded. For Elvis, the incident was already transforming in his mind into something larger than a small insult. It had become another reminder that strength wasn't in proving others wrong loudly, but in showing them a truth so simple it silenced the room. And in that silence, something shifted, not only for the girl behind the counter, but for him as well. The store went back to its business. Shirts folded, cash drawer closing with its usual metallic snap, but under the ordinary rhythm lingered a different weight, a whisper that would follow those present long after they stepped back into the Memphis sun. Dignity could be disarming, more powerful than anger, more unforgettable than pride. And for Elvis, it was proof yet again that what others laughed at could become a man's greatest crown. Part 4. The conversation after the incident. The bell above the door had long since stopped ringing, yet the echo of what happened lingered in the air. The young saleswoman stood still behind the counter, her palms pressed flat against the cool surface, as though she were bracing herself against a tide. The other shoppers who had witnessed everything shuffled awkwardly, each pretending to browse while silently wishing they hadn't joined in the laughter. The fluorescent lamps buzzed above, filling the silence with their faint electrical hum. Then, to everyone's surprise, Elvis didn't leave immediately. He stopped at the doorway, turned back, and walked slowly toward the counter. His steps were unhurried, deliberate, like a man deciding against letting a wound scab over too quickly. The clerk's breath caught in her throat as his shadow stretched across the counter once more. "I don't want you walking away thinking I came here to embarrass you," he said gently, removing his sunglasses. His eyes, sharp yet kind, fixed on her with a sincerity that startled her. "What you said. It reminded me of a time I used to hear that every day." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The apology she wanted to form caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. Elvis glanced at the folded shirt in his arm, then back at her. "Tell me something. You're young. Are you in school?" His tone wasn't accusing. It was curious, as though he truly wanted to know. She blinked, startled by the question. No, sir. I finished high school last year." Her voice was barely audible. "You ever sing?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice even softer now. Her cheeks flushed. She nodded once, quickly, almost ashamed. "In church, and a little in the school choir. But not anymore." "Why not?" Her answer came out in a rush, like a secret she had been holding for too long. "Because people laughed," said. My voice cracked. Said I sounded silly. She forced a weak smile, though it trembled. I figured they were right. The parallel struck him deeply. The room seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in the narrow space between counter and racks of shirts. For Elvis, Her words were like hearing his own story retold in a younger voice. The ridicule, the doubt, the slow erosion of confidence. "You know," he said quietly, "they said the same about me, about my voice, my moves, the way I looked. Papers called me a clown. Some preachers said I was dangerous. My own classmates didn't think I'd amount to much. If I'd listened, if I'd let their laughter set my path, I'd still be working odd jobs, hiding my guitar in the corner when company came." The clerk swallowed hard. The shoppers nearby had stopped pretending to browse. They listened openly now, their earlier shame giving way to fascination. They were watching something they would later recount in hushed tones. Elvis Presley speaking not as an untouchable icon, but as a man revealing his scars. He leaned a little closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Don't let them decide for you. What you think is weakness can turn into the thing that carries you further than you imagine. But you gotta be the one to hold on." Her eyes shimmered, and she nodded slightly, though she wasn't sure if she believed herself capable of it. Still, his words slipped past her defenses, planting themselves like seeds in soil she thought barren. Finally, sensing he had said enough, Elvis placed the sunglasses back over his eyes. "You'll remember this day for a long time," he said softly. "Make sure you remember it for the right reason." He turned then, truly leaving this time. The door opened with a faint creak, and the sunlight spilled inside. As he stepped out, his figure was briefly outlined by the glow of the afternoon, a fleeting silhouette that seemed larger than life, and yet deeply human at the same time. The room exhaled after he left. One of the older customers shook his head slowly, whispering, "Never seen anything like that." Another simply muttered, "Makes you think." The saleswoman remained rooted behind the counter, her pulse hammering in her chest. Her earlier smirk felt like something belonging to another person entirely. She brushed her hand quickly across her cheek, drying a tear before anyone noticed, though most already had. For her, the encounter wasn't about being scolded by a famous man. It was about being seen, really seen, by someone who had lived through the same sting of ridicule and come out stronger. It wasn't just his words that unsettled her. It was the realization that he had chosen not to condemn her in front of strangers, but to draw a parallel, to share his own humiliation, to give her a glimpse of a path she hadn't considered possible. Outside, Elvis slid into the driver's seat of his car, the leather warm from the sun. He sat for a moment without turning the key, his thoughts lingering on the girl inside. He knew the expression she wore, the mix of shame and gratitude. He had worn it himself once, years ago, when someone finally believed in him. As he finally pulled into the street, the store shrank in his rearview mirror. But he carried with him the quiet conviction that what had happened inside wasn't just an awkward exchange. It was a reminder. Every time he chose grace over pride, every time he transformed laughter into dignity, he was still fighting the same battle he had begun as a boy, with shiny hair in Memphis classrooms, and in that battle he was determined never to surrender. The engine of the Cadillac hummed softly, but Elvis wasn't in a hurry to drive away. He sat with his hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at the bustle of Memphis streets. His sunglasses couldn't hide the faraway look in his eyes. That brief moment in the shop had cracked open something deep inside, a memory he thought he'd buried beneath years of fame, screaming crowds, and glittering stages. The girl's embarrassed face reminded him of his own reflection when he was 19, standing on the threshold of Sun Records for the first time. He could smell it even now, the thick blend of tobacco smoke, the metallic tang of recording equipment warmed by hours of use, the faint musk of old wood floors. It wasn't glamorous. The place looked more like a converted office than the birthplace of legends. Yet, to Elvis, it had felt like a cathedral. He remembered clutching his cheap guitar case so tightly, his knuckles whitened, his palms sweating through the worn leather handle. His hair, that high, slicked-back crown of pomade and Vaseline, seemed louder than his voice in that moment. A couple of the engineers looked up and snickered when he walked in. One whispered, "Looks like he's trying out for a carnival act." Elvis had pretended not to hear, but every syllable lodged like a splinter. Then Marion Keisker, Sam Phillips's trusted assistant, had asked him what he wanted. His voice cracked slightly when he said he'd like to make a record for my mama. It sounded foolish, even to his own ears, but Marion hadn't laughed. She had simply nodded, pulled out a form, and told him to write his name. Later, when Sam himself walked in, Elvis felt the same judgment in the man's raised brow, though it was tempered with curiosity. Sam didn't dismiss him. He let him sing. And as soon as Elvis's voice filled that tiny, smoky room, the snickers faded. The hair they laughed at became part of the image they remembered. The thing mocked in school hallways had suddenly made him stand out in a crowd of hopefuls. Sitting in his car years later, Elvis exhaled deeply, the memory still sharp. The laughter in the shop had transported him back to those days when he was raw, fragile, and desperate for someone to take him seriously. He ran a hand slowly through his thick hair, feeling the weight of it, as though it still carried all the jeers and ridicule he had endured. But his flashbacks didn't stop at Sun Records. They carried him to 1956, the year television turned him into both a sensation and a target. He remembered the headlines after his first national appearance. A clown dipped in axle grease. A menace with a greasy mop of hair. The words had been printed in respectable newspapers, read by families across America. He remembered buying a copy late one night, sitting alone in his room, staring at those lines until the letters blurred. He had sworn he wouldn't let it get to him. But it did. It always did. Even after the adoring crowds, after the gold records, after the Vegas triumphs, those lines followed him. Every time he looked in the mirror before stepping on stage, he heard them faintly. Clown, greasy, ridiculous. Fame didn't erase the sting. It only buried it beneath louder applause. Now, in the stillness of his Cadillac, he admitted something he rarely said aloud. The ridicule had never truly left. It shaped him. It haunted him. It pushed him to prove himself again and again, long after he had nothing left to prove. And it was why the incident in that clothing shop gnawed at him. The girl's careless laugh wasn't new. It was a reminder that no matter how high he climbed, the echo of that mockery followed. He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, deep in thought. He could have left the store with nothing but a bruise on his pride. He could have forgotten the whole thing, chalked it up to ignorance. But the look in the clerk's eyes, that sudden collapse from arrogance to shame, the admission that she too had given up singing because of laughter, stayed with him. Elvis realized he didn't want the story to end there. He didn't want it to be another fleeting episode of embarrassment, soon forgotten by everyone except the girl who would carry her shame quietly. He wanted to turn it into something else, something that might shift her path the way his had shifted when someone, finally, heard him without laughing. The Cadillac's cabin smelled faintly of leather and faint traces of cologne, a cocoon where he could think without interruption. He leaned back against the seat, closed his eyes, and remembered his mother's voice, soft and unwavering. "Baby, don't let them tell you who you are." She had said it countless times, holding him when he came home wounded from schoolyard cruelty. And he realized, in that moment, he had become the voice that girl behind the counter might need. As the sun dipped lower and the Memphis streets filled with long shadows, Elvis made a decision. The story wasn't finished. Tomorrow, he would make sure of it. The next morning in Memphis dawned with the heavy, humid air of late summer. Elvis woke earlier than usual, restless from a night of circling thoughts. The memory of the young clerk's trembling face kept pushing to the front of his mind. Most incidents with strangers faded quickly in his life. The autograph seekers, the gawkers, even the hecklers. But not this. He couldn't let it go, because it wasn't only about her laughter at his hair. It was about the confession she had let slip. She once loved to sing, but she had stopped because ridicule had crushed her. That felt too close to home. By mid-morning, Elvis was behind the wheel of his Cadillac again, this time with 2 members of his security team following in another car at a discreet distance. He wanted space, not spectacle. He pulled up in front of the same modest clothing store, the neon sign buzzing faintly above the entrance. The bell chimed again as he stepped inside, and once more the cool, pressed smell of fresh garments greeted him. The saleswoman looked up from arranging a display of scarves. Her face drained of color when she saw him, as if the very air had been knocked from her lungs. She froze, her hands still gripping the folded fabric. Elvis removed his sunglasses and offered a small smile. "Morning," he said gently, his drawl soft, calming. "Don't be scared. I came back for you." The words startled her. "For me?" "Yes," he replied simply. "Got something I want to show you." The store manager appeared, stiff with nerves at the sight of Elvis Presley standing once again in his shop. Elvis gave him a polite nod and said, "Mind if I borrow your clerk for a little while? I'll make sure she's back safe." There was no refusal in the man's eyes. How could there be? The manager just nodded, and Elvis gestured for the young woman to join him. She hesitated, unsure whether to move, but something in his calm persistence urged her forward. Within minutes, she found herself in the passenger seat of his car, Memphis unfolding beyond the windshield as he steered them away from downtown. The silence stretched, heavy with her nervous breaths. Finally, Elvis spoke, his hands steady on the wheel. "You said yesterday you used to sing." She shifted uncomfortably, staring down at her lap. "That was a long time ago." He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. "Doesn't matter how long ago. The question is, do you still want to?" She swallowed hard. "I don't think I'm any good." A faint smile touched his lips. "That's what they told me, too. Over and over. Said I'd never make it. Said I sounded strange. But I kept going. And look what happened." He let the words hang, not boastful, simply factual. They pulled up outside a low, nondescript building on Madison Avenue. To the outside world, it looked plain. To Elvis, it was sacred ground, a studio where countless nights of trial and triumph had shaped his career. He cut the engine, turned to her and said, "Come on. I want you to see something inside." The air was thick with the faint metallic tang of microphone stands and the warm, dusty scent of amplifiers. The overhead lights were dim, casting a gentle glow on the worn wooden floors. Elvis guided her to the center of the room, where a microphone stood, its cable coiled like a waiting serpent. She froze in place. "I can't. I don't belong here." "Yes, you do," he said firmly. "Everyone belongs here, if they've got something in their heart they need to let out." Her hands trembled as she touched the microphone stand. The steel was cool beneath her fingers, grounding her even as her knees shook. She looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "What if I sound terrible?" Elvis leaned against the piano nearby, his presence steady, reassuring. "Then you'll sound terrible. But you'll know you tried. And maybe you'll find out it's not as bad as you thought." The room was silent, but for the faint hum of equipment. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and let a few tentative notes slip from her lips. The sound wavered at first, thin and fragile, but as she continued, her voice steadied. It wasn't perfect. It cracked slightly in places, but it was sincere, unfiltered, and carried a raw sweetness that filled the space. When she stopped, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. Elvis began to clap softly, the sound echoing through the studio. His eyes shone with something more than approval. It was recognition. "See?" he said warmly. "You've still got it. Don't throw it away because somebody laughed once. If I had done that, we wouldn't be standing here right now." Her eyes filled with tears, not of shame this time, but of something closer to relief. She pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed. Elvis walked closer, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Remember this," he said softly. "The world will always laugh first. But if you stand your ground, if you keep singing through it, one day they'll stop laughing, and they'll start listening." The moment settled between them like a vow. For her, it was the beginning of a new possibility. For him, it was a reminder of the long road he had walked from ridicule to recognition, and the responsibility he carried to pass that lesson on. As they left the studio, she turned back for one last look at the microphone, her eyes lingering on it as though it had awakened something she thought long dead. Elvis watched her, sensing the change. He didn't need her thanks. The look on her face was enough. Driving her back to the shop, he said quietly, "Yesterday you saw me as a joke. Today you saw me as a man. But tomorrow, maybe you'll see yourself different too." The words stayed with her long after she stepped back onto the shop floor. And they stayed with Elvis as well, a reminder that even small encounters could ripple far beyond the moment. In the weeks that followed, Memphis carried whispers like wind over the Mississippi. It began quietly, as most stories do. A clerk telling a friend over coffee about how Elvis Presley had walked into her store, endured her cruel joke, and instead of anger had offered her a chance to sing. She told it with embarrassment at first, lowering her eyes as she confessed her mistake. Yet the more she repeated it, the more the humiliation gave way to something else: gratitude. The story spread quickly. Memphis was a city where word traveled faster than the streetcars that rattled down Main Street. A bus driver overheard it in a diner. A hairdresser repeated it to a line of waiting women. A mechanic swore his cousin had been in the store when it happened. Each retelling shaped the event, sanded some edges, exaggerated others. But the essence remained. Elvis had chosen grace where others would have chosen pride. It reached the local press before long. Tucked between reports of city council meetings and football scores, the Memphis Press Scimitar ran a small column. "Elvis Presley teaches kindness in a corner shop." The piece was brief, almost reluctant in its tone, but it was there. A reminder that even in his hometown, where people often judged him harsher than anywhere else, the man could surprise them still. When Elvis first read the clipping, he was sitting on the wide porch at Graceland. The cicadas hummed in the evening heat, and the house smelled faintly of cut grass and fried chicken drifting from the kitchen. Joe Esposito handed him the newspaper, folded open to the tiny article. Elvis chuckled quietly as his eyes traced the lines. "Look at this, Joe," he said, his voice soft, thoughtful. All that noise I make on stage, all the hours in Vegas, and what makes the paper is me buying a shirt." Joe grinned. "It wasn't the shirt, E. It was what you did." Elvis leaned back in his chair, exhaling. His gaze lingered on the horizon where the sky was streaked with orange and purple. "Sometimes it's the little things that matter most," he murmured, "the things nobody plans." But beyond the porch, the story had legs of its own. People in Memphis began to talk about it not as gossip, but as proof of character. For many who had doubted him, who had thought success had turned him arrogant or distant, it was a reminder of the boy from Lauderdale Courts, the kid who never forgot what it felt like to be laughed at. Meanwhile, the young clerk retreated into anonymity. Reporters came knocking, eager for her to tell her side, but she declined every request. She didn't want her name in print. What she carried was private, too raw to be paraded in headlines. She told friends, "It was his kindness that mattered, not me making a fool of myself." At Graceland, Elvis thought about her more than he admitted. The music business, with its contracts and endless performances, often left him feeling hollow. Yet here was proof that his presence could change someone's life off stage as powerfully as it did under the lights. He folded the clipping and tucked it away in a drawer where he kept personal treasures. A photo of his mother, Lisa Marie's drawings, and a few letters that meant more than gold records. The incident became part of local lore. Taxi drivers swore they knew the street where it happened. Some insisted they knew the clerk's name, though they were usually wrong. The story took on a glow, like a folk tale, proof that the king wasn't only about rhinestones and stagecraft. He was capable of lowering himself to eye level, of turning ridicule into a moment of grace. For Elvis, it wasn't publicity that mattered. He hadn't staged it, hadn't wanted recognition. What mattered was the private knowledge that in one ordinary store, with fluorescent lights and racks of shirts, he had passed along a lesson he himself had bled for. One night not long after, while rehearsing with his band, Elvis put his guitar down mid-song and said quietly, almost to himself, "Funny thing. Folks remember the songs, sure, but sometimes they remember more the way you make them feel, and that can't be bought." The band grew silent. They were used to his occasional philosophical turns, but this one struck a chord. They nodded, understanding without needing to ask what he meant. The resonance of that afternoon in the store wasn't measured in headlines or applause. It was measured in the way people whispered with a kind of reverence when they retold it, in the way the clerk carried herself differently afterward, and in the way Elvis himself folded the memory carefully into the fabric of his life. And though he never spoke of it often, when he did, he framed it not as his triumph, but as a reminder. Sometimes, the smallest encounters echo the loudest. Las Vegas, 1972. The Hilton shimmered like a jewel in the desert night, its neon lights pulsing against the endless black sky. Inside, the casino floor rattled with the constant chime of slot machines, the laughter of gamblers, the clatter of dice against felt. To most, the city was electric, intoxicating. To Elvis, it was often a cage dressed in gold. After another show, one of many in a grueling schedule, he retreated to his suite. The room was quiet except for the muffled hum of air conditioning and the faint echo of the crowd still buzzing in his ears. On the dressing table lay a stack of envelopes, brought up by a hotel staffer. Fan letters came by the thousands. He could never read them all. Most contained the same words of devotion, requests for autographs, declarations of undying love. He appreciated them, but they blurred together after a while. Yet one envelope stood out. It was plain, with no return address. The handwriting was small, careful, almost shy. Something about it made him pause. He opened it slowly, sliding a single sheet of lined paper free. "Mr. Presley, I am the girl from the clothing shop in Memphis. I laughed at your hair. You could have humiliated me, but you didn't. Instead, you gave me a chance to sing. I never forgot that. Because of you, I found the courage to take lessons. I'm still not perfect, but I sing again, not for others, but for myself. You made me see I was more than a mistake. Thank you." There was no signature, just those lines, written in neat blue ink, and nothing more. Elvis read it once, then again, his eyes moving slower each time. The noise of the casino, the glow of the strip, even the exhaustion in his body seemed to fall away. He sat heavily in the armchair, the letter trembling slightly in his hand. All the applause of Las Vegas, the standing ovations, the flashing cameras, the endless bouquets thrown at his feet, none of it pierced him as deeply as these few quiet sentences. Here, in anonymous ink, was proof that something as small as patience in a store had rippled outward, had shifted another life. It wasn't measured in ticket sales or chart positions. It was measured in courage, rekindled, in a voice that refused to die. He set the letter on the table beside a framed photo of Lisa Marie, his daughter. He kept a few personal treasures there, mementos too precious to be lost among the clutter of fame. With care, he folded the letter again and slipped it between the photo and its frame, pressing it close as if anchoring it beside what mattered most. Then he rose and walked to the wide hotel window. The strip blazed below him, a river of neon and headlights. He could hear faintly the laughter of gamblers through the glass. Yet his mind was miles away, back in Memphis, inside that cramped shop with its fluorescent lights, smelling of fresh cotton and starch. He saw again the young woman's reddened face, her trembling hands, the way she had whispered that she once sang, but stopped because of laughter. Now, years later, she sang again. And that meant more to him than the glowing marquee with his name 10 stories tall. He thought of the irony. All his life, he had been mocked for the very things that defined him. His voice, his moves, his look. He had turned them into his armor, into his crown. And in showing one stranger how to do the same, he had unknowingly given her a piece of the resilience he'd fought so hard to hold on to. Elvis whispered into the empty room, almost as if speaking to her across time and distance. "I'm glad you found your way back." The suite was still. The letter sat quietly on the table, unremarkable to anyone else, yet priceless to him. Outside, the casino lights kept burning. The world kept moving. But inside, Elvis felt something rare: peace. He stayed by the window long after midnight, watching the desert sky shift from black to deep indigo. For once, the roar of the city didn't matter. The true music that night came from a voice he would never hear, belonging to a woman who had rediscovered her song because of a moment most would have dismissed as trivial. And for Elvis, that was worth more than any encore. Summer of 1977 carried a heaviness that lingered in the walls of Graceland. The once bustling mansion, filled with music and laughter, seemed quieter now, as if holding its breath. The halls were dim in the evenings, the air thick with the scent of old wood and polished leather. Elvis often withdrew to smaller rooms, away from the constant hum of his entourage, choosing instead the company of a few close friends. One night, gathered in the den with a handful of trusted companions, he sat slouched in a deep armchair, a glass of water sweating on the table beside him. The television flickered in the corner, muted, its glow dancing across his tired face. He looked older than his years, though the spark in his eyes still appeared when he spoke. The conversation drifted lazily, stories from tours, jokes recycled from years on the road. Then someone asked, half in jest, "E, if you had the chance to do it differently, maybe without the hair, the sideburns, the flashy suits, would you have taken another road?" The room quieted, waiting for his reaction. Elvis leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. A faint smile touched his lips, not of amusement, but of reflection. "You know," he said slowly, his voice carrying the low timbre of weariness softened by warmth, "that hair everyone made fun of. It was never just hair. At first it was a shield. Kids at school laughed, sure. Papers mocked it too. But it was mine. It was me saying, 'I'll stand out, even if it costs me.'" He paused, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling as though seeing something far away. The others listened silently. He continued, his voice quiet but steady. "And once, a girl in Memphis laughed at it, just like everybody else used to. But instead of walking away, I stayed. I talked with her. Found out she'd quit singing because people laughed at her voice. Reminded me of myself. So I gave her a chance. Took her to a studio. Told her not to let laughter stop her." A few of his friends exchanged glances. Some knew fragments of the story. Others were hearing it for the first time. Elvis didn't raise his voice, didn't dramatize it. He spoke as if confessing something private. "Years later," he said, his voice almost a whisper now, "she wrote me a letter. Told me she'd found the courage to sing again. Not for fame, not for anyone else, just because she loved it. That letter meant more to me than any gold record hanging on a wall." He fell quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the far wall. Then he added, softer still, "So, if you ask me whether I regret it, the hair, the mockery, the whole road I walked, no. Because that road gave me the chance to remind someone else not to give up. That matters more than all the records, more than the shows. That's the part I'll carry with me." His friends sat in reverent silence. They expected bravado, maybe a joke to deflect the heaviness. Instead, they witnessed something rare. A man stripping away the image, speaking plainly of what mattered to him at the end of it all. Elvis reached for the glass of water, took a slow sip, and set it down. His smile lingered faintly, as if the memory itself gave him a quiet satisfaction. He looked less like the king of rock and roll and more like the boy from Lauderdale Courts, who had once stood before a cracked mirror and combed his hair defiantly, daring the world to remember him. Later that night, after the others had gone to bed, he stood alone by a window in the upstairs hallway. Graceland was hushed, the gardens outside lit only by the dim glow of porch lamps. The cicadas sang in the humid Tennessee dark. Elvis leaned against the frame, staring into the night. His reflection stared back faintly in the glass, the famous silhouette, softened now by age and fatigue. He thought of his mother's words, of Sun records, of the stage lights and the jeering critics, of the girl's trembling voice in that Memphis studio, of the letter folded behind his daughter's photograph. A lifetime condensed into fragments, each bound by the same truth. The ridicule that once wounded him had become the very thing that allowed him to lift someone else. He whispered into the stillness, perhaps to himself, perhaps to the night beyond the glass. "That's enough. That's more than enough." The house remained silent. The world outside spun on, unaware of the man in the window. But within Graceland's quiet walls, the story of a hairstyle once mocked, once ridiculed, had come full circle. Not as vanity, but as a symbol of resilience, of grace, of the power to turn laughter into strength. And as the night deepened, that truth lingered like a final note of a song. Not loud, not triumphant, but unforgettable in its quiet echo.